Hello, football fans, and welcome back to another James Talks About the NFL. And today I'm going to be talking about the legacy of Dan Marino. Now, Dan Marino is regarded as one of the greatest Miami Dolphins to ever play for the franchise, and he is considered by many to be the best quarterback in Dolphins history. You could say that Bob Greasy was a better quarterback than Dan Marino, but we're not talking about Bob Greasy. We're talking about Dan Marino because this is the legacy of Dan Marino. Okay, so Dan Marino played quarterback for the Miami Dolphins from 1983 through 1999. And believe it or not, Dan Marino was a late first round pick. Like, he was like pick 27, and back in 1983 there were only 28 NFL teams, so just about every NFL team passed up on him. Well, every team except the Redskins back then passed up on him. Go figure on that one. But yeah, so he made it to the Pro Bowl 9 times, 1983 through 1987, and then 1991, 92, 94, and 95. Now, I'm surprised that he didn't make it any time later on in his career, like 96 through 99, but I suppose that's when he was out of his prime. But then again, that's when Don Shula stopped coaching him. And if you don't know who Don Shula is, then that is the greatest coach in Miami Dolphins history. And I think Don Shula's wins in his time as the Dolphins head coach are more than the Dolphins' other head coaches in franchise history that they've had combined, and for the time that they've spent as the Dolphins coach. And Don Shula is considered to be the greatest head coach of all time. But yeah, regardless, he was first team All-Pro early in his career in 84, 85, and 86, and then a second team in that regard, 83, 92, 94, and 95. And he was the MVP in 1984. And then he was the Offensive Player of the Year in 1984 as well. 1984 was like Dan Marino's best year as a Miami Dolphin, and that was the year that he went to his first and only Super Bowl appearance, which they ran into a buzzsaw in a good San Francisco 49er team. And because of poor drafting by Don Shula and the Miami Dolphins organization on defense particularly early on in Dan Marino's career, they never built up a defense to complete the Miami Dolphins. Like, you had Dan Marino, you had the offense all set, but they just never had the defense going for them. They just couldn't complete themselves. Like, the Dolphins would get into shootouts, particularly against Danny O'Brien and the Jets back in the 80s. But yeah, that's besides the point. So after he got injured in 1993, then he was awarded the NFL Comeback Player of the Year in 1994. And then he was the AFC Player of the Year in 84 and 94. And then he was the Rookie of the Year for the NFL in 1983. And considering that John Elway was also entering the league in 83, and then you had Eric Dickerson entering the league, and a couple of other Hall of Famers entering the league, then that's impressive. And then he was the passing yards leader. So, like, he threw for the most yards in 1984, 85, 86, and then 1988 and 1992. And he has his number 13 that he wore back when he was playing for the Dolphins. That number 13 has been retired since he retired himself. And, I mean, had the Dolphins had a defense like they did back in the 70s, they probably would have gone to the Super Bowl more often under Dan Marino. But the fact that he had them in the playoffs pretty much every year with no run game and no defense, he had a couple of great receivers, particularly early on with Mark Clayton and Mark Duper. So they really helped him out. And he was a first ballot Hall of Famer in 2005, so but I mean, Dan Marino is still among the top 5 or top 10 quarterbacks of all time in terms of passing touchdowns, with 420 passing touchdowns. I'm not sure if he got knocked down to like number 6 because I think Tom Brady passed him pretty recently. But yeah, so I just don't know where he lists or where he ranks there, but in terms of great quarterbacks, he should pop into the conversation, but because of the fact that he didn't have a great defense, he wasn't contending for Super Bowls every year, so I guess that's why he gets overshadowed in terms of the greatest quarterback of all time debate. But yes, I think he's one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time. Well, certainly the greatest quarterback of all time not to win a Super Bowl. Which, to win a Super Bowl, and to retract that and say the greatest quarterback of all time, I honestly don't know who that is, but you just have to throw Dan Marino into the conversation because he was great and he led that Dolphins team regardless of not having a defense or running game like I just mentioned. But yeah, he did have a legendary coach, but that can only take you so far. And I know that you might say that, oh, great defense can only take you so far. Well, what about the 70s Steelers and the 80s Niners? I mean, those teams had good defenses, and those teams each won 4 Super Bowls in the 70s and 80s, respectively. But yeah, it would mean that the Dolphins wouldn't need to score a whole lot of points with Dan Marino. I mean, I think Dan Marino just had to score a whole lot of points because the Dolphins' defense wasn't that good. I mean, you can look up games between the Dolphins and Jets with Dan Marino, the Dolphins quarterback, of course, from what I mentioned. And then the Jets quarterback, Danny O'Brien, just slinging it around, each getting like 300, 400 passing yards and epic shootouts. You know how that goes. But yes, the Dolphins have definitely not been the same since Dan Marino retired, and that can speak volumes to the type of greatness that he had as a Dolphin. And Yeah, I do think that Dan Marino is the greatest Dolphin quarterback. Respect to Bob Greasy, but I just think that Dan Marino is better than Greasy. Despite the fact that Greasy won a couple of Super Bowls, but Super Bowls do not translate to success. Super Bowls are a team effort. The MVPs, the Comeback Player of the Year, the Pro Bowls, all that stuff is just Dan Marino at his finest. And he was in the 80s and early to mid 90s. But yes, guys, I do believe that will wrap it up for this James Talks About the NFL. And until the next video, I will see you all later. Goodbye, guys. Thank you all for watching.